Round 2 of Super Rugby Pacific 2025 is upon us. Let's jump right into the fantasy picks for this week. First thing you want to do is look at this week's fixtures. You want to see the matchups where a lot of points are going to be scored, because that's where you want to pick your players from. This week, in contrast to round 1, we got a lot of matchups where one team is quite heavily favored. They will be the ones scoring the points. Chiefs versus Crusaders is quite close, but we saw last week Crusaders, they played quite an open game with the Hurricanes, so I wouldn't be surprised if there is decent points scored here. So this week you really can't go wrong, but me in particular, I am focusing on the Hurricanes versus the Endrua. This is being played at home for the Canes, and the Endrua, they play terrible when they're away. I'm also targeting Reds versus Pacifica as well. Again, Pacifica is kind of a weak team. This will be at Suncorp in Brisbane. It's the Reds' first game, so a little bit of an unknown there, but they should still be able to put a lot of points on Pacifica. And again, down here, Brumbies versus the Force. Brumbies at home, that should go well for them. Blues are playing the Highlanders away in Dunedin. It is under the cover though, should be good conditions, and I don't think the Highlanders will be able to hang with the Blues, so Blues players, probably not a bad investment either. Now, if we have a quick look at my own team, it's not 100% final, but you can see I've picked up a lot of Hurricanes this week. Remember, you can only have 4 players from one team each week, so even if you think a team is going to go well, you got to decide which are the 4 best players to pick from that team. In my case, I've gone with Naholo. That's a big pick. The outside backs, they're the ones who really get huge scores in fantasy, so I really want to have some outside back exposure to the Canes. You can double down here if you want. Finiang Anofo on the other wing, he's not a bad choice. He'll probably get points as well, but I am trying to avoid being overly exposed to one game in particular in my outside backs, just in case things don't go like I think they will. Otherwise, another big change is the return of Hoskins Sotutu, the Blues number 8, player of the year last year. This guy, he is a stats machine. He dominated so many stats last year, not just the tries scored, but the offloads, meters, line out tags, busts, like everything. He was just doing everything on the park and everything that gets points in fantasy, so I'm really excited to pick him up for this round. It says that he's actually injured in fantasy, but as far as I can tell, that's bogus. I haven't seen anything to say that he is injured. Let me know if that is not the case. Other than that, you can see I've picked up a lot of Reds for their first round. Don't forget that the Reds are playing. If you played last week, you sort of ignored them. Don't forget that they're back. Take a close look at their players. They won't show up if you're just looking at players according to how many points they got from last round. They're not going to appear, so you have to look closer than that. I've picked up both Fluke and Paisami in the midfield. Part of that is that I was quite disappointed from all the midfield players last week. None of them really seemed to perform as well as I expected. Not just the ones I picked, but just the category in general. Maybe that's just the nature of the games last week, the fact that they were all so closely contested. This week, I wouldn't be surprised to see midfielders pick up a lot more points, maybe even competing with those outside backs. But that's encouraged me to try out this red centre pairing for my own fantasy, and both of these players, they're really good for fantasy in their own right as well. Paisami, he's a devastating ball carrier. He's the sort of guy who will rack up that defender's beaten stat. That is absolutely worth the points. And Josh Fluke, he sort of benefits from the work that Paisami does. He's on the outside, he can get those offloads and he can convert them into tries or try assists, line breaks, line break assists. So I'm actually really happy with this pairing, and the matchup is so good against Moana Pacifica. They should be able to penetrate that defense and really rack up some points. I've also picked up Fa'agasi up here in the props. To be honest, it's a bit of a muchness with props for me. I'm not sure you could really make a lot of choices here. You can see from round 1, really, these guys, they don't get out of that sort of 30-point bracket. And there's also this lottery aspect to it as well, because something is going wrong with how scrum points are applied to players. The players, they're not getting credited enough fantasy points for the amount of scrums that are happening in every game. I don't know what's up with that, but until they fix it, it really means there's just not a lot of points on offer here. I've stuck with Xavier Numere from last week. I picked him last week just because we know he's the type of player who's really good around the park. He makes those carries, he gets meters, he can do tackle busts, get offloads. He was pretty quiet last week, didn't get much done. I'm sticking with him this week, having a bit of faith, might not pay off. Either way, no biggie if it doesn't work out. With Fa'agasi, I'm not committed to him. I really just picked him up because he is quite cheap. He is only $3 million. I did actually run into some salary cap issues this week, which kind of surprised me. Bringing back Mark Talia really put a big hole in the budget, so I had to shuffle a few things around just a little bit to make up a bit of cash, and prop was a good place to make up that cash. Some other options you might want to consider down here as well. The Brumbies have brought back their big guns this week, Alan Alatoa and James Slipper. These guys, they're not huge workhorses around the park. They're not going to get a lot of fantasy points around the park. They will have a really strong scrum though, and we saw last week in that Force Pacifica game, the Force scrum came under a lot of pressure late. The Pacifica scrum was just steamrolling them. Eventually the Force did get carded for just so many scrum penalties. The Brumbies, having this full strength propping lineup, they could really put the pressure on the Force at scrum time. They could rack up a lot of tight heads, more scrum points for them. Outside chance maybe you're getting a try because it's just a bit of a mismatch. One other quick thing to mention with the props as well, this is a pro tip. There is in fact a back rower, Taitua Lima, who is listed as a prop in fantasy. He was the top scoring prop last week just because back rowers, they get more opportunities to score fantasy points than props do. Taitua Lima, he is a guy to keep a very close eye on for that reason, because he will probably be the best prop you can pick all year. But this week, unfortunately, he is on the bench. That means he might not get enough game time to rack up some serious points. But to be honest, with how weak the prop position is for scoring fantasy points, he still might be a good pick off the bench anyway. And the Brumbies, they are taking on the Force. There will be opportunities for him to score points. So definitely not a bad choice. Definitely still one to consider. Something to think about, but again, I mean, I wouldn't get my hopes up. Not a lot going on in this position. Don't sweat it too much. Next up, looking at hooker. This is an important position because hookers do score very well. They get points for scrums. They get points for lineouts. They're at the back of those mauls. They get tries from that. I think these top three here are the three best options. I was inclined to go for Ricatelli, but again, I had budget issues. He is 7 million. That's kind of inexpensive for a hooker. I decided to bring in Devry. He is cheaper, only 3.5 million, but Hurricanes, they're taking on the Endure this week. The Endure, they give away so many penalties. Most penalized team in the competition last year. That means the Hurricanes, they should be able to kick those penalties for the sideline. There'll be a lot of lineouts. They could kick for the corner and set a lot of mauls as well. Devry, he could be the one to benefit off that in the form of maul tries. I'm happy with that as a pick for 3.5 mil. The other good option is Pollard down here for the Brumbies. Brumbies are taking on the Force. They've got that full strength forward pack. They're playing at home in Canberra. They're a team that loves to maul. Force, they're not a super strong team, so the Brumbies, they should really be able to bring that maul against them. And Pollard, again, he could be the one to benefit from that in the form of maul tries. Definitely not a bad bet. Same with Ricky as well. Blues taking on the Highlanders. The Blues pack, they're going to be smarting after getting outfought by the Chiefs last week. They will be training hard. They will be going down there to be physical with the Highlanders. They could get that maul going, and again, Ricky, he could be the beneficiary. And finally, I'll give a quick shout out to Richie Asiata as well. Starting hooker for the Reds. Again, the Reds are up against the Pacifica. They could be able to get that more going and he could benefit. But Matt Fazler, he is on the bench. He's probably their preferred starting hooker. That means Asiata, he might get subbed early, so I would probably be careful about picking up Asiata. Now looking at the locks, again we have a situation where the top scoring lock is actually a back rower who has been listed at lock by mistake in the form of Cullen Grace. He did get a try last week in round 1 that did pad out his score a bit. If you take away his try, he really doesn't have a lot of points. He would be in this sort of middle of the pack for the lock, so I wouldn't sweat picking him up too much. It's not a huge deal. Again with lock, much like prop, they're really not racking up huge amounts of points. I've gone with Shalfoon because he is a starting lock that is very cheap. And I've gone with Nick Frost because he is very tall timber. He does get a lot of those line out receptions, and the Brumbies, they're in a favorable matchup against the Force where he will get more opportunities to score points. Other good options to look at though, Fabian Holland, very good on one side of the ball. On the defensive side, the Highlanders, they're taking on the Blues. The Blues, they just smash it up with those forwards. There's going to be a lot of tackles to be made. Fabian Holland, he'll be one of the guys racking them up. Tui Piloto didn't do so well last week. This week might be more opportunity for him to really get his carrying game going, make some meters and score some points off the back of that. Also, don't forget about Tupou Vaa'i. He has been promoted to a starting berth this week, so he will have more opportunity to get a proper haul of points in a tough match against the Crusaders, but he is probably one of the best locks in the competition in terms of being busy around the park. So could be a good investment if you don't mind paying $5 million for a lock. If you're not budget constricted, I would pick him. And still can't go wrong with Scott Barrett either. Would have had closer to the top score if he didn't get that yellow card last week. Not gonna happen every week, but well, it is Scott Barrett, so you know, maybe it will. Moving on to a more interesting position, the back rows. Like I said before, the big one to consider is Hoskins Sotutu. He is a stats machine. He's playing in a good matchup to score points, and I think he's close to a must pick, but we'll find out after this game. The other one I've gone for is Luke Reimer. He was huge against the Endrua last week. Got 2 tries. He's probably not going to do that every week, but I mean, you could just tell by watching him, if you've got eyes, his performance was huge. I don't think you'll ever go wrong with this guy. I've gone with Ardie Savea as well. He was just super solid last week. He was in everything, just doing a bit of everything, getting points. I feel like he's going to be a very consistent player, even though he might not be the one. He might not have a high ceiling in terms of getting really huge scores. Just because he is in the Pacifica team, they are a bit weaker. They're just not going to score as many tries this year. They're not going to get as many line breaks. They're not going to have as much balls. So, you know, I don't think he's a must pick. A lot of people are still picking him, but I think he will be consistent and solid. Another option to consider though is Miracle Failangi. I said this in my last video, in my recap, that he did kind of outshine Ardie a bit with ball in hand, and that's reflected by him having a higher score here. Definitely a guy to keep an eye on. Dalton and Sean Withy, they will both continue to be solid picks this week. Dalton, he did get a try last week, padded his score out a little bit, but he is probably going to continue to get opportunities to score tries just being in the Blues, a better team, a strong team. Sean Withy, he got an insane amount of tackles. I think he got 27 tackles against the Waratahs. In this game, the way the Blues play, just bashing it up with their forwards, there's so many tackles on offer, and Sean Withy is going to be there. Like, he's probably going to get more tackles than he did last week. This guy, he could be setting records. 4.5 mil, he will be solid. Doesn't do a huge amount ball in hand. Probably not going to get you tries, but definitely a solid pick. Kind of the same story with Karifi and Suafoa. Suafoa, he actually got 28 tackles, I believe, last week. He got one more than Sean Withy. That's just an insane amount of tackles, which just reflected how much more ball the Chiefs had than the Blues by the end of the game. Karifi's probably a little bit more dynamic. He can get in, get those turnovers, make a few more carries. He is a bit busier, so I would probably prefer him. There is Jacobson as well. Usually plays at 8, gets a bit more opportunity coming off the back of the scrum than some of these other guys, but again, just another solid player, also gets turnovers as well. Ethan Blackadder, he was a little bit of a bust last week. The guy, he has this huge work rate on both sides of the ball. He's just going. Energizer bunny. He can't be stopped, but he really had very little to show for it in terms of points. Like he really is a battering ram. He gets the ball, he runs into a brick wall. He doesn't get meters, he doesn't pass it, he doesn't offload. So that's really a reflection of how he plays. Braden Ayose, he's definitely a pick to seriously consider. I was quite big on this guy last year and in round 1 based on his performances last year. He didn't really get up to much last week, unfortunately, but I think he still will be the goods. I think it's just the way that match was played last week. The backs were getting a lot of ball. It was quite expensive. He wasn't really able to get the ball that he wanted. I wouldn't be surprised though if he kicks on this week and has a great performance in fantasy and on the pitch. I would seriously consider picking him. In fact, I probably would pick him over Artie, but I am at that 4-player limit for the Hurricanes, and it's just kind of tricky for me to drop some of these guys like Devry. I need him because he's cheap, he's keeping me under budget, and yeah, it's just depending on which way you tip with some of these decisions, you may or may not have this problem. But if you don't, if you have room for more Hurricanes, I would definitely seriously consider Ayose. Otherwise, we have all the Reds players back as well. Fraser McWright, like the other 7s, very busy, definitely a good pick. Harry Wilson, not too bad either. And these Endura forwards, Darren Nalangi is very good, but I think the Endura, they will struggle against the Hurricanes this week. Another big name who's actually listed as injured, if you're just relying on the fantasy status, is Charlie Cale. I'm certain he was named in the Brumbies team. He's another very good fantasy player. He just racks up the points. He's in a good matchup this week, only 6.5 million. I might swap him in for Artie if I can be sure that Cale is going to start, but again, I might not want to double down too much on these Brumbies. I do have room to take more though, so we'll see what happens. This isn't my final team. Devry's not necessarily going to be my captain. He probably won't be. But in your case, definitely consider Charlie Cale as well. Now, looking at the halfbacks, for me, I think it's really hard to look past Cam Roigard. I think he's pretty much going to be a lock for this season. There are other good halfbacks here, but just Roigard, I think he's just going to be getting more points more often. Kyle Preston, he is getting the start this week against the Chiefs, but he's not going to get 3 tries every week. I mean, maybe the Crusaders, maybe they're back, maybe they run riot over the Chiefs like they did against the Hurricanes. But you take out these 3 tries, he really doesn't have a lot going on otherwise, and he did play a lot of minutes because Hotham was injured very early. So you look at Roigard in comparison, and he's just got a lot more going on. Tackles, defenders beaten, line break assists. Like Preston, unless you really think the Crusaders are going to run riot over the Chiefs, I would not be considering him. Another one though I would pay attention on just for the future is Folau Fakatava. Last week he came off the bench, got a decent amount of points considering. This week he's starting, but it is against the Blues. That'll be a tough game. Best defense in the competition last year. But for future matchups, maybe Cam Roigard's not available. Fakatava, he will be a very strong option just because he's that type of sniping player. he'll take those snipes, he'll get line breaks, he might get some offloads, line break assists. And that's the sort of player that we like for fantasy, those players that are just a bit greedy. Moving on to the 10s, again, it's really hard to look past Damian McKenzie. I had him in my team last week, but I did not make him captain. I was one of those people, I thought that Chiefs versus Blues game was going to be tough. I didn't think there would be a lot of opportunities for the backs. But really, the Chiefs, they took over in that last quarter, that last third. McKenzie, he picked the game up by the scruff of his neck, and he ran riot. He got those true tries. He was the top fantasy point scorer last week with 104 points, a huge haul. I thought making him captain would be a smooth brain play, but boy was I wrong. All these people who captain McKenzie or used their triple booster on him, they just rocketed to the tops of the leaderboard. They got a huge amount of pay out of that. And I mean, is that the play this week? I don't know. I mean, again, Chiefs versus Crusaders, again, it's another tough game, but it's just so hard to ignore how McKenzie plays. Like he plays that style ball in hand. He's always trying to create something. He's trying to create those line breaks, those assists. He goes himself, and that's what you want out of a fantasy player. And at 10, he's always getting those opportunities to kick goals as well, which gets you extra points. That makes the 10s always pretty solid for points. McKenzie's not only solid though, he's got that high upside as we've seen last week. Pretty hard to pick anyone else for this fly half slot, and I mean, he might even just be the best captain every week as well. Pretty hard to justify picking any of these other guys over him. A lot of these 10s, they're sort of young, they're just getting their feet. Bowden Barrett, he cost 10 million. He plays at fullback, but he likes to kick the ball a lot. He just doesn't attack the line himself a huge amount, and that means he's not going to get huge fantasy points. Ben Donaldson, super solid, hero of the game last week, but again, he's just as reliable as he is, he isn't McKenzie. So yeah, just really hard to pick anyone else in this position. Moving to the midfields now, and like I explained earlier, I was really disappointed with this position. I mean, look at this, like 24 points for the current starting highest scoring midfielder. There were higher scoring ones, but again, they were getting up around 30. Like there just was not a lot going on in the midfield. Maybe that's a reflection of what the games were like last week. They were all so close. So all the action, it was either happening up front or happening out on the wings. I do expect midfielders will do better this week, but we'll have to wait and see. Because I wasn't impressed by any of these guys last week, I have gone with the Reds center pairing this week. Little bit of an unknown there because the Reds haven't played, but I mean, we've seen these guys play before. They're both very good individually and as a pair. They're in a good matchup against Pacifica this week. I expect them to do as well as anybody, if not better. If I wasn't picking them, I'd probably be looking at guys like Balin Sullivan for the Hurricanes, just because I really like the look of that Endura matchup for the Hurricanes. I expect the backs to get a lot of play. Other guys you might want to look at though are other ones who are coming back this week who didn't play last week. Guys like Len Ikitau, he's quite a devastating ball runner. He can get those tackle busts and offloads, and he is coming up that against the Western Force, a weaker team. He will have some opportunities. Ramek Kaporhipi, he didn't play last week. He's coming back, very direct player. In that tough game against the Crusaders though, I probably wouldn't consider him, but I'd keep an eye on him and see how he goes. Leonard Brown, he's also getting a starting berth this week. Last week he came off the bench, didn't get a lot of opportunity. I feel like Leonard Brown isn't a great fantasy player. A lot of what he does is sort of like being the glue and just sort of tidying things up. He's not necessarily the sort of guy who gets the ball and just tears the other team apart. He's not a selfish player either, and these are the players we're sort of looking for in fantasy. Another one I'm keeping my eye on though is Levi Almua. We know he's a devastating ball runner, but ever since he went to the Crusaders, we really just haven't seen him get the opportunity to just run over people or really be that devastating ball runner that we know he can be. We've seen flashes of it, but even last week where the Crusaders were running rampant, he seemed to benefit the least from it out of anybody. So until we see the Crusaders using him in a way that lets him shine more as a fantasy player, I don't think I will be considering him. And now onto the outside backs. This is the juicy category. You really have to think about the choices you make here, just because it's a real boom bust category. Your outside backs, they're capable of getting these huge scores up in this sort of 80 plus area like we saw with these guys last week, but they can also just end up sitting on the sideline kicking stones with nothing coming their way. So you want to be very thoughtful about who you pick there. You want to try and work out which guys are most likely to get those 80 plus points in their games, because if you can work out how to pick those guys, that's going to carry you up the leaderboard through to the end of the season. Be careful as well setting your captain in the outside backs as well, just because of that boom bust dynamic I just described. You do not want to waste your captaincy on a player who just ends up getting 20 points or something. I've gone with Sevu Reece. This guy, he's probably my favorite outside back pick. I had him last week. He got 91 points. And the reason I like Sevu Reece is because we know even if the Crusaders are terrible, even if the game's not going their way, with Sevu Reece, he can still thrive. We saw that all of last year where he just dominated all kinds of stats. He shared the top try scorer award with Hoskins Satutu. He had all these offloads, line breaks, everything, and he did it basically with scraps. It's almost like he plays better the worse the Crusaders are. And even in that game last week, that was a tough game for the Crusaders. They were behind against the Hurricanes. They had to come from behind to win. And Sevu Reece, like, he just went completely beast mode. The guy, he plays so greedy, and that's exactly what we want from a fantasy player. We want a guy who just goes looking for the ball and carries it himself and tries to take on the game by himself. That's exactly what Sevu Reece does. I expect him to keep doing it this week against the Chiefs. I don't expect him to be as successful. I don't think this game against the Chiefs will be as open as that Hurricanes game, because the Hurricanes, they do like to play expansive as well. But I think the Chiefs, with their big forwards performance against the Blues, I think they're really going to try and stick it to the Crusaders up front as well, and that's where the game will be decided. But still, Sevu Reece, he's always going to be a solid pick. I think he will always be in my team. Moving on to other picks though, like I said, I really like that Hurricanes and Drua fixture. I think it's going to be a lot of opportunities for Hurricanes outside backs to get fantasy points. I've gone with Kenny Naholo. He's the left wing. He's the number 11. I'm hoping he just gets fed. I'm hoping he's on the end of all of those opportunities that the Hurricanes get and that they can convert. You could consider Finianganofo as well, or even consider picking up both of them. They're not that expensive if you want to double down on that fixture as well, if you like that fixture. I'm kind of avoiding that just because I do like the Hurricanes and some of these other positions, and I am at the 4-player limit. But I also don't want to be too exposed to one particular fixture. And because this week so many of these fixtures do offer a lot of points for a lot of teams, I'm happy to spread it out a bit. That's why I've gone with Mark Telea. Didn't do that well that last week, but this week it'll probably be a bit of an easier game for the Blues. There will be more opportunities for him, and I expect him to convert some of them. And even if he doesn't, the guy is so slippery. He just goes into contact and he makes tackle busts where he's got no right to. So he's always going to be a guy who can get points. Caleb Tangatau had that huge breakout last week. I don't think he will go as well this week. They are up against sterner opposition in the Blues instead of the Waratahs. Same with Taumoi Falau. This guy is so good. He's got really good attributes. He's such an athlete. But again, he's in a weaker team, so it's sort of hard to pick him. We'll see though. He might be one of those guys that's just so good that he's always able to rack up points even even when things aren't going the team's way. One to keep an eye on. Leroy Carter, he really impressed me in that Blues Chiefs game just because he was able to make strong runs when not a lot was on. These guys who can do that in the tough games, they'll run rampant in the open games as well, but they'll also just be really solid, really consistent picks. Again, not picking him for this Crusaders match because I expect that game will be kind of tough, but definitely one to keep an eye on. Will Jordan, he's another popular player, had an amazing effect on the pitch in round one. He was Johnny on the spot. He was on the end of plays. He was hitting gaps. He was getting those line breaks assists. He was making connections to his outsides in space. He played brilliantly. Didn't score a try. Got 61 points for his trouble, which is a pretty good effort for a guy who just did not score a try. He's also going to be another really consistent pick as well, one you can't go wrong with. But I'm going to wait until the Crusaders get a slightly easier game. Then maybe I'll consider doing that 1-2 Reece Jordan combo. Tavatava Nawai, he's been playing really well. He's been moved into the midfield and he's doing crazy stuff. He's getting turnovers like he always did, but he even kicked the 50-22. He's super busy. He is the captain. Didn't really get a lot of points last week for all the effort he put in, and that included scoring a try. I think that's just a consequence of being moved to the midfield, maybe. I don't know. Really like this player, but yeah, I don't think that he's gonna be a great investment going forward. Corey Toole, he was a bit of a bust last week against the Drua in a messy game. I'm thinking the Brumbies getting their big names back, they might be a bit more clinical. That might mean Corey Toole does get to benefit from the Brumbies being strong in that game against a weaker team, the Force. Not so sure though. I'm a big fan of him otherwise, but I got burned last week, so I just want to wait and see how he goes this week. And don't forget about the players who weren't in last week who have come back in now. Tom Wright, he's a big name. If you want to pick a guy in the backs for the Brumbies, if you like that matchup, I think he's your best option. Not cheap though, 9 million. If you can afford him and you like the matchup, take him. Otherwise, you got some other options here from the Reds as well. Tim Ryan, the junkyard dog, he's not a bad pick. Drop Campbell at the back. He racks up those run meters. He does like to carry. He can slip defenders. And Dalgurno as well in that 11 slot. He is the guy who will be cashing in on whatever moves the Reds make. So no bad options here either. And the Drua, again, I think they're going to struggle against the Hurricanes playing in New Zealand. Your outside back picks are so precious. I really would not look at these guys. The last thing to talk about is who to make captain. I really just have not decided. Again, you're always going to get a consistent performance out of a hooker. They're never going to be a terrible captain, but unless you really expect that team to run in a lot of maul tries, like you got a team with a strong maul against a team with a clearly weak maul, yeah, they're not often going to deliver on that ceiling that they have. And again, like I said earlier, with the outside backs, it's boom bust. They can get those high scores, they can get low scores. You put your captain there, it's really risky. Think carefully about that before you do it. And then the other option is D-Mac. I mean, yeah, I think he is going to be solid as well. I think he's going to be the always solid captaincy pick because he's never going to get a low score. He's always going to get those shots at goal to prop up his score. He plays so much ball in hand, he's always going to get some breaks or line break assists or try assists. And then when it's his night, he's going to get those tries as well, and that's just going to push him up through the ceiling, and that's exactly what we saw in round one. So because I don't know, because I'm so unsure, I'll probably end up making D-Mac my captain, but we'll see. We'll see. Anyway, guys, that's all I have to say for this round. Let me know what you think. Let me know who you're picking and who your top picks are. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next one.